Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm just answering some questions about Ogregate and Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. I think most of these stem from some Reddit threads and a recent review. One of the questions kind of threw me, so I'm going to try to answer it, but I'm not sure that I even really know what the question means. So I'll do my best. Also, this is very early. I haven't eaten yet, so if I get sidetracked or if I'm not focused, it's because I haven't eaten. So again, Wandering Heroes of Ogregate is our WHOG tabletop RPG that's available at Drive-Thru and at Studio 2 in print. And Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades is a book I wrote with Jeremy Bai, who's a translator of Shansha fiction, and that is available through Osprey, and it's a one-off. It's just one game. It was based off of the Ogregate system, but it is its own game because it takes it in a very different direction. The key difference is there are fewer abilities in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades that each character has to make the game more manageable, but the abilities are more broad in scope, and so they have signature abilities, whereas Ogregate has kung fu techniques. And so the first question is asking whether Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades is postmodern. No, I don't think so. I guess it depends on what you mean. If you're asking me, like, if it's based on ideas like you would find in, say, Foucault or Derrida or Lacan or any of these people where linguistics was heavily influential in how they saw reality, no. I've read Derrida. I don't think I understand Derrida all that well. I had to read Foucault. I don't like Foucault. I think his ideas are wrong. And generally, when obviously I have to use a lot of history books when I'm researching Ogregate and stuff. I generally avoid postmodernist historians when I can. There have been a few instances where I've had to because they were dealing with sources that I wanted translations or analysis of, or despite the fact that they were postmodern, they actually had something very interesting to say. There was one book, I don't have the name off the top of my head, but there was one book, for example, that was using architecture as text, and normally that kind of thing pisses me off, but in this case I thought they were making some insightful analysis around it, so I thought that their particular approach still worked, and they weren't like 100% postmodernist. They were just drawing on some postmodernist techniques. But generally I avoid postmodernist historians because I find them it takes forever to decipher what they're trying to say. They just have a tendency to write in very obscure language, and they use a lot of jargon when they don't need to. And I just don't agree with a lot of their underlying ideas. That said, I understand that when people talk about postmodernism in media, they mean something different than that sometimes. And so I Googled, what would a postmodernist tabletop RPG be, and I'm going to go through and explain with each of these points how I think the game is or is not. So one thing that they talk about is narrative deconstruction and subversion of tropes. I don't think there's a lot of that. Now, I will say a lot of what we do is based on, wuxia novels and on Shaw Brothers films from like the 70s, and there were a lot of subversion of tropes in some of that media, and we're kind of replicating tropes like that. So maybe in a way, but I don't think that the purpose is parody or deconstruction. Like, we're not trying to do like an Ashes of Time type of thing. We're just trying to do dark and gritty wuxia, and that has a certain style. I wouldn't call it postmodern, but and also some of the other things are like moral relativism. I mean, it's dark, but I think there's still kind of right and wrong. It's just that some characters don't care. there are morally gray characters, but that doesn't mean the world is morally gray. So, I don't see it as postmodern. Maybe I'm not fully understanding what a person means by postmodern in media. But I think here's where it gets more, because that's just narrative stuff. That's just like tropes. But I think when you get into like mechanics, I think when people are talking about postmodern RPGs, they're talking about how the game actually functions. And Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades is a pretty traditional RPG, whereas there aren't the authority of the GM isn't changed. There isn't like a lot of uses of meta currency and things. They're just and there aren't really heavy there's no like narrative mechanics in our Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades. And so I don't know. I don't think that Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades would be regarded as a postmodernist game. And I think if somebody were looking for a postmodernist wuxia RPG and you directed them to Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades, I think they would be disappointed. Because I think in a lot of ways it's I would draw a distinction between parody and tongue-in-cheek. The tongue-in-cheek, I think, is a little bit more affectionate towards the source material. I think parody is making fun of the source material. Maybe that's a false distinction to some people, but I think that we have some tongue-in-cheek elements, but we're not mocking wuxia, and we're not even mocking like the more excessive qualities of it. We enjoy that stuff. So I don't see it as postmodern. And so the other question that I got was whether Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades or Wandering Heroes of Orgate are suitable for anime. I don't think so. I mean, I think you could probably use Wandering Heroes of Orgate for anime. I think Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades, you could use the system, but you'd have to really build on it. You'd have to kind of swap out a lot of the signature abilities. You might want to change a lot of things. I don't think that it gets quite to the scale that anime often gets to, but I guess it would depend on the anime. I'm not super influenced by anime, so I guess like, because anime can mean anything from like Grave of the Fireflies to like Akira or Vampire Hunter D. So I don't know, or Princess Mononoke, right? So like, and also all the anime I'm familiar with, as you probably just realized, is like older stuff. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think you might be able to tweak the systems and get what you want. Orgate's closer, but Orgate also has a very specific setting, so it might be hard to direct that to what you want. So I would not recommend it for anime. That would not be my, and that's not a knock on anime. I just don't think that the games were at all thinking about anime when they were designed. And the other question is, why aren't the signature abilities or kung fu techniques balanced? I addressed this in a blog post, but there's a lot of reasons for that. So number one, when we first started, one of the things we tried to do was make the games as balanced as possible. We did that all the way up through Sartorius, and I think for the most part we succeeded. The issue is the games were kind of dry, and you can see that if you go and look at our back catalog, you'll see a shift around when we made Sartorius and when we put out a supplement called Book of the Archon, where we veered away from that. The games got a little more exciting, and so that's basically the reason, is that the techniques would not be as fun if they were balanced. I know that some people really like balance, and some people get upset when a character's weaker or whatever. That both games say up front that they're not designed to be balanced in that way. So you're not going to enjoy yourself if you need parity between the characters. It's a game where there are some choices that are better than others. Though I will also say these are not always choices. Like, one of the things both games do emphasize is acquiring abilities in game, and so you can't necessarily just get the broken technique if there's no reason for your character to get it in the setting. So there's that. So there's any balance is more organically arising from the setting. And so the other thing is, it's trying to emulate, wuxia and kung fu movies. And in those, there are some characters that are just more powerful than others. That's just kind of how the genres work, and we wanted to embrace that. And there's a self-correcting measure within the genre where a lot of the storytelling revolves around a broken ability or power is introduced, or maybe a broken weapon is introduced, and the whole martial world, and I apologize, I'm getting text messages here, the whole martial world has to respond to that by either coming together and coming up with some sort of clever tactic for handling it, or inventing new techniques that deal with it. And so in Ogre Gate, there's this idea of the evolving kung fu landscape. And so that's kind, and again, that's not, it's the techniques are still not balanced, but that goes a long way in practice. Like, I've run Ogre Gate for years. I've been running Ogre Gate since 2014, pretty much nonstop. Like, there's been a couple of breaks when I've had to run other systems, but even when I was running, like, we were working on Strange Tales in New England for 5 years. During that period, I ran several Ogre Gate campaigns alongside the playtests I was doing for Strange Tales in New England. Because I whenever I would do something like that, I'd have 2 weekly groups, and I would usually have an off group on Saturday. The off group I don't do anymore because I don't have the time, but Ogre Gate is something that I've been playing for a very long time, and it's very easy to manage any issue that comes up around a technique by just remembering that the martial world is not going to necessarily, sit still while somebody just goes around using, Blade of the Dancing Fox on everybody. People are going to start realizing, oh, we have to do something about this, and people will start trying to develop techniques and counters to it. And that's a genre trope. That's something you see in the Flying Guillotine movies. The whole plot of the first movie is trying to figure out how to work around this super deadly weapon that nobody can seem to stop. And one of the characters has to invent another weapon and kind of devise a technique to use it in response to the Flying Guillotine. So he creates like a metal umbrella to capture the thing, and it's interesting. You see it in Lady Hermit. You see it in all. You see this all the time in the genre, and so any plot where some terrifying martial expert, is going around terrorizing people with the supreme kung fu ability or the supreme weapon, that's a thing. And so the other thing is, the game doesn't necessarily assume it embraces drama, but it doesn't embrace the narrative structure. And so drama happens sort of organically. The GM is not meant to shy away from it, but the GM is also not meant to say, okay, where are we in terms of adventure structure, in terms of plot structure. So it's not worried about if characters get total party killed in the first leg of an adventure. That's not considered a problem in the game. And again, it's probably more likely to happen in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades than Ogre Gate, because Ogre Gate you have a little bit more of a buffer with your health. But in general, the idea of getting, anticlimactically killed by a henchman is not really considered a problem for the system. Because you're playing to find out what happens, and so you're kind of playing to find out, who are these characters really? Are they the heroes, or are they people who just died along the way and then the real adventure starts? And so in my blog post I mentioned the Crippled Avengers, and I would encourage, and again, that's more of a kung fu movie, but I would encourage people to watch that film. Number one, it's kind of like the sequel to the Five Deadly Venoms. That's how people think of it that way. It's pretty much the same cast, and it's got a lot of similar elements to it. The Five Deadly Venoms is probably I think it's a more beloved film, and it's maybe a little bit tighter. But the Crippled Avengers is one that I kind of enjoy more. And in that movie, the characters all get crippled at the very start of the film. One of them gets deafened, so he can't hear. One of them gets his head stuck in a vice, so he becomes kind of a moron. Another one becomes blind. Another one I think he can't use his legs. And it's all because the main villain in the movie, he lost his arms, and his father built these mechanical arms for him. And his father is so enraged that his son was crippled that they're kind of venting out their anger on the world. And so they cripple these heroes. And the plot is basically these guys going and learning how to develop martial arts that will allow them to overcome their whatever it is they lost, their maimings that they sustained. And then they get revenge against the bad guy, and that's the kind of plot that would arise from those sort of things. Not every time, you're not guaranteed that plot, but that's the kind of plot that the game allows to happen because it embraces the surprise of the dice, it embraces lethality and maiming, especially Righteous Blood. Righteous Blood maiming is quite likely, and so that's what it goes for. And again, just to tie it to the postmodernism thing, that's not really meant as parody. That's stuff that you see in the genre. Like I just described the plot of the Crippled Avengers. That's not parody. That's a real movie. And a lot of movies are like that, and they are over the top, and they don't follow. They might not feel as grounded as the stuff you would see in like a Western martial arts movie, say, but that's a lot of the fun of them. So that's what the stuff is trying to get. And now the other one, and I know for a fact that this was from a review because I googled it, and it's from a review. But the question is, the question is whether the Coen brothers were an influence on Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, or Ogregate. And the answer to that is no. We don't. I'm okay with Coen Brothers movies. I liked Fargo. I think The Big Lebowski is a lot of fun. I don't really like Raising Arizona, to be honest. I liked Miller's Crossing, but I'm not a huge fan of that style. And it really didn't shape anything that went into Ogregate or Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. I think that all of the influence people are seeing is like 70s Shaw Brothers movies. Really, that's really where a huge chunk of the influence is coming from. There was this period in the 70s where the movies got really gritty and dark, and I don't remember where Ground Zero is for that, but like you start seeing it with movies like Finger of Doom and Intimate Confessions of a Chinese Courtesan and The Black Tavern, and then you see it with movies later like Killer Klans. And again, I'm mentioning a lot of Choi Yuen movies because he was kind of one of the guys that was at the forefront of this. But you also see it in even as early as like movies like Golden Swallow by Cheng Che, where the character at the end, Silver Rock, he gets like crucified at the end of the movie. Not literally crucified, but I mean it's a battle scene that almost feels like a crucifixion, and to such an extent that I think if you saw it in isolation from the whole movie, you might think it was parody. He ends up, I think he's got like 4 swords in his body. He's riddled with arrows. He's dead 10 times, and he's still standing. It's that kind of his thing. And that seems to be built on something that Cheng Che was doing in the movie The Assassin that also starred Jimmy Wang Yu as the same type of character. A little more heroic in The Assassin and more grounded in history. And it's a little bit more of a subdued movie, but the ending is similar. And so it's really trying to get that kind of a vibe. I think a lot of people who are coming to our games and are looking for wuxia, I think sometimes their point of reference might be things like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Hero, or just later, more recent movies that might be a little bit more grounded. But the main inspiration for things like Ogregate and Righteous Blood. Well, Righteous Blood is 70s Shaw Brothers, Gulong, Choi Yuen movies. It's very specific. Wandering Heroes of Ogregate is Shaw Brothers, so all that period, including the classic period before that, and like 80s and 90s wuxia, which gets really gonzo. So things like Duel to the Death, or the Swordsman series, Bride with White Hair, stuff like that. I think the tone is a little different. I would encourage people to go watch Duel to the Death. It's number one, the fight choreography in that is amazing, but it's just a really gonzo wuxia movie with ninjas and swordsmen and samurai and swordsmen, and it's got kind of a Japanese versus Chinese plot line, but it is astounding, and there's stuff in there that, again, if you saw it in isolation, you would think it's parody, but it's just genre stuff. Or go see even something like the Brave Archer series, which is just based on the classic Condor hero story. That's like a foundational wuxia thing. That has some really over the top elements too. And again, it's not parody. It's just that's the sort of the world these characters live in. And so we tried to stay true to the tropes that we were seeing in the genres. None of this is meant to mock the genre. None of this is meant as parody of the genre. None of this is certainly meant as to play like Fargo or something. That's like the furthest thing from our minds with it. You're seeing characters like in Heroes Shed No Tears. There are these martial heroes who are so skilled they kind of can be whoever they want to be, and they're driven by these personal codes and these codes of chivalry that exist in the martial world that sometimes drive people to extreme behavior. So there's a character, I think her name is Graceful, in Heroes Shed No Tears, who's sort of caught in the middle of a love triangle. And this villain plots to sort of pit these two heroes against each other who are sworn brothers by making them fight over the woman. And she ends up, she's a dancer, and one of the characters adores her because he loves nothing more than dance. He's this really macho guy, but when they introduce the character, we see him just enthralled in dance, and he's dancing with this graceful character, and it's a really interesting contrast in his personality. And in order to kind of amend the situation, Graceful cuts off her own leg, and it almost borders on silly, but if you're invested in the movie and you're taking the movie seriously, it's a moving moment. And so I think that that we are not approaching it in the postmodern holding things at arm's length distance. I think that both Jeremy and I were really in love with the genre, and we just loved these tropes. It wasn't about needing to engage in humor because otherwise you feel silly taking it seriously. Sometimes the things do rise to a level of humor, especially in an RPG, because in an RPG you can never really predict what's going to happen. And so, you're going to end up with ridiculous situations like you get in, like, say, Call of Cthulhu or something. But I think that part of the thing is not us striving for it's not us striving for like a Coen Brothers feel. It's us just sort of accepting that this is a game, and so you can't really determine what's going to happen, and sometimes wild things will result. But also the kinds of movies and stories we were basing this on, where just wild stuff happens in these films. I mean, again, I just mentioned a bunch of movies. Sometimes it's a little tricky to sort of go back through the whole catalog and remember something on cue, but I can guarantee you, if you go back and you watch movies like Magic Blade or something, you're just going to see some wild stuff. Or Swordsman and the Enchantress. Again, it's I don't think that it's meant to be comedic. I think it's sort of got a degree of whimsy to it at times, and I think that wuxia gives itself a lot of permission to be creative in ways that you don't see in a lot of Western media. I think it's one of the reasons why it's so enjoyable. So again, I hope that answered the questions. And also, I know these were based on a review. I know the reviewer didn't, because I went back and looked at it, and I was aware of the review when it came out, but I didn't know about the Coen Brothers thing until I Googled this. And even though the reviewer didn't like it, I just want to say the reviewer put a lot of time into the review. I can tell, so I appreciate them taking the time. And obviously, I don't share their gaming sensibilities, so I don't necessarily agree with the conclusions. But I think that people who are coming to the game looking for that kind of balance would certainly be disappointed. So I mean, there's value in the things that they're saying from that perspective. So I'm always happy when people review the game. So if you review and you didn't like it, I wish you would have liked it, but it's perfectly fine. I want people to give their honest opinions on things. So yeah, but I do hope that I answered some of the questions that people were asking after the review. So and again, if you have any more follow-up questions, anyone, just feel free to send them to me. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. The best way to do that is on the Bedrock blog, just to use the contact page. If that's not working, because I've heard people say that's not working, you can probably PM me at a place like the RPG Pub or the RPG site where I post. I'm just Bedrock Brendan at all those places, and just PM me a question. I'll answer it. I sometimes get behind on these Q&As because I'm doing a lot of stuff right now, but I'm going to try to answer more of these because I have I get emails through through our website as well, and sometimes I'm not the best at answering these things. So anyways, I will let you go, and I will talk to you later.